Congresswoman Omar, I intend to ask you a straightforward question. If the United States and Somalia were to hypothetically engage in war, which nation would you desire to see victorious? Speaker Mike Johnson's voice pierced the atmosphere of the House Ethics Committee chamber like a surgical blade, cold, calculated, and absolutely clinical. It was not the tone of a politician seeking a soundbite for Fox News, but rather the voice of a constitutional attorney who had spent 6 months constructing a trap and had just sprung it. A silence that was total and suffocating descended upon the room. Representative Ilhan Omar sat at the witness table with her expensive Washington defense lawyer beside her, a barricade of binders and folders organized like a fortress before them. Throughout the previous 6 hours, she had been deflecting, explaining, pivoting, and launching counterattacks. She had labeled the proceedings a witch hunt, a charade, and a misuse of taxpayer funds. She had appeared defiant, confident, and even bored at moments. But this inquiry was different. This question removed the nuance, stripping away the talking points regarding imperialism and the complexities of foreign policy. It presented a binary choice, a yes or no, us or them, and everyone in that chamber understood she could not answer it. The silence elongated until it became physical, a heavy weight pressing down on the chests of all who watched. 10 seconds passed, then 20, and then 30, while the C-SPAN cameras zoomed in to capture every micro-expression in high definition. They recorded the way Omar's eyes darted frantically toward her lawyer, pleading for an objection that would not arrive. They captured the way her knuckles turned white as she gripped the rim of the mahogany table. They recorded the way she parted her lips to speak, then closed them again, realizing that any sound she made would be the wrong one. 40 seconds passed, then 50, and finally, a full minute elapsed. In the world of television, a minute of dead air is an eternity, a lifetime, and essentially a confession. The hearing room was filled to capacity, with every seat occupied. The press gallery was overflowing with reporters seated on the floor in the aisles. Other members of Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, stood at the back because there were simply no chairs remaining. Everyone had known this hearing would be significant, as Speaker Johnson rarely chaired committees himself unless the stakes were historic. However, nobody had anticipated this, the quiet and methodical real-time destruction of a sitting congresswoman. Johnson sat at the head of the committee table, immobile, neither gloating nor smirking. His hands were folded neatly atop a thick black binder. Behind him on easels stood poster boards covered with charts, timelines, and photographs that had been methodically unveiled over the last 6 hours. To his right sat the committee's chief counsel and a team of investigators. To his left were the other members of the Ethics Committee, all Republicans, because the Democrats had boycotted the hearing, labeling it a political hit job. That boycott was now appearing to be a catastrophic strategic error. The empty Democratic chairs did not make the hearing look illegitimate, but rather made it appear judicial. Without the usual partisan shouting matches, interruptions, and grandstanding, the room felt less like a circus and more like a courtroom. It felt like a prosecution. Omar was dressed in a bright turquoise hijab and a sharp, dark blazer. She had attired herself for the cameras, preparing for the viral clip she assumed would emerge from this event. She anticipated the moment she would stand against the white patriarch and speak truth to power. She had survived attacks far worse than this in the past. She had been branded a terrorist, accused of anti-Semitism, and threatened with death. On each occasion, she had emerged stronger and more defiant, a martyr for her cause. Yet Mike Johnson had not attacked her faith, nor had he attacked her race or her gender. He had simply presented the documentation. Johnson finally broke the silence, though he did not raise his voice as he had no need to do so. "Allow me to restate the inquiry to make it even more elementary for you, Congresswoman," Johnson said softly. "You swore an oath when you became a citizen of this country. You stood in a federal building, raised your right hand, and you vowed to absolutely and entirely renounce and abjure all allegiance and fidelity to any foreign prince, potentate, state, or sovereignty." He leaned in slightly, his gaze locking firmly onto hers. "You pledged loyalty exclusively to the United States. Did you intend to keep that vow when you took it, or were you lying?" Omar's lawyer, David Brennan, a man whose hourly rates could deplete a small town's treasury, leaned over and whispered urgently in her ear. His complexion was ashen. She shook her head imperceptibly, whispering a reply with lips that barely moved. The microphones captured the noise of frantic murmuring, though not the specific words. Johnson waited patiently, knowing he had the entire day and the evidence, and could wait indefinitely if required. Finally, Omar spoke, her voice, usually so commanding and projected, emerging strained and thin. "That is a loaded question," she stammered. "It presents a false dichotomy that does not reflect the complexity of my views." "It is only a loaded question if you cannot answer it honestly," Johnson interrupted. He did not snap, but corrected her like a teacher correcting a student. "Every American in this room knows the answer immediately if asked which side they would want to win in a war involving their home. They would say, 'America.' Why can you not say that?" More silence followed. The trap had snapped shut. If she said "America," she would be contradicting the secret recordings Johnson had just played, recordings of her telling Somali officials that her first loyalty was to them. She would be perjuring herself based on the evidence already presented. If she said Somalia, she would be admitting to treason on live television. She would be admitting that she lied during her naturalization ceremony, stripping her of her citizenship and her seat in Congress. So she said nothing, and the silence screamed the answer for her. "The fact that you cannot answer," Johnson said, "tells us everything we need to know. You cannot say America, because everyone in this room has just seen 6 hours of evidence showing you have been working for Somalia's interests. We have seen the bank records, we have heard the tapes, and we have seen the votes. But you cannot say Somalia either," Johnson continued, "because that would be admitting you lied in your citizenship oath. It would be an admission that you are serving in this body under false pretenses." He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. "So you say nothing," Johnson concluded, "which is itself an answer." Omar stood up suddenly, her chair scraping violently against the floor. Her composure cracked. "This is a witch hunt," she shouted, her voice shaking with genuine rage and panic. "This is Islamophobia disguised as oversight. You are persecuting me because I am a black Muslim woman who dares to speak truth to power. You are trying to silence me." Johnson's expression did not change, and he did not blink. "Sit down, Congresswoman." "I will not sit down," she yelled. "I represent the people." "This has nothing to do with your religion," Johnson said, his voice cutting through her shouting with icy precision. "And it has nothing to do with your race. This has to do with your actions. This has to do with documented evidence of foreign agent activity. This has to do with money you received from foreign government sources. This has to do with phone calls where you coordinated with foreign officials to undermine U.S. policy." "Sit down," Johnson repeated. She sat because she had no choice. She sat because the sergeant-at-arms had taken a step forward from the door. She sat because her lawyer was pulling on her sleeve with desperate force. Johnson picked up a single document from his binder. "Let me show everyone what we found," Johnson said. "This is a phone transcript from an NSA intercept in March of this year, where you are talking to Somalia's foreign minister. He held the paper up, and you say, and I am reading your exact words, I will always prioritize Somalia's interests because that is my first loyalty, while America is just where I work. He looked up at her. Let that quote hang in the air, Johnson said. America is just where I work. Not your country, not your home, and not the nation you swore an oath to defend. Just where you work, like a job, Johnson said with disgust. Like you are a foreign agent who just happens to have a congressional office and a security clearance. The room erupted. To understand how we arrived at this moment, where the third-ranking Muslim in Congress ended up in a House hearing room, unable to say she would want America to win a war, you have to rewind the clock. You have to go back 8 hours to a time when Ilhan Omar walked into the Longworth House office building thinking she was untouchable. It was just after 8 in the morning, 8 hours before the silence. Representative Omar sat in her office suite, surrounded by the trappings of her power. The walls were lined with framed magazine covers and photos of her speaking to adoring crowds. She was relaxed, scrolling through Twitter on her phone and sipping coffee. Across from her sat David Brennan, her high-priced attorney, and Marcus Osman, her chief of staff. They have nothing, Omar said, chuckling as she read a tweet from a supporter. Look at this. My base is already mobilized. They are calling it a racist show trial, and the hashtags are trending. We are going to raise $1 million off this hearing by noon. She looked up at Brennan. Mike Johnson has been investigating me for 6 months. If they had anything real, it would have leaked by now. This is just red meat for the MAGA base. It is theater. Brennan nodded, flipping through a folder of anticipated questions. The subpoena is broad, covering compliance, communications with foreign officials, and campaign finance. It is a standard fishing expedition. We stonewall on anything sensitive and invoke privileges where applicable. The Democrats are boycotting, which plays into our hands. It delegitimizes the whole thing, and without a quorum for formal action, they cannot do much but talk. Marcus Osman was flipping through a stack of pre-written press releases. The media strategy is set, he said confidently. The second they go after you on Somalia, we frame it as attacking your advocacy for refugees. If they bring up money, we say all contributions were FEC compliant. If they question your foreign policy, we pivot to the First Amendment and your right to criticize U.S. imperialism. We make this about free speech and identity. Omar nodded, feeling the familiar surge of adrenaline. I am not worried, she said. I have survived worse than Mike Johnson. Trump went after me and McCarthy threatened me. Yet I am still here. They always overplay their hand. They always look like bullies. And I always win. She stood up and checked her reflection in the mirror. She looked powerful, and she looked ready. She had no idea that she was walking into a slaughter. 3 blocks away in the Speaker's office inside the Capitol, the atmosphere was entirely different. There was no laughter and no scrolling through Twitter. There was only the quiet rustle of paper. Mike Johnson sat at his desk, surrounded by binders. He was not acting like a politician preparing for a debate, but like a prosecutor preparing for a murder trial. Before he entered politics, Johnson had been a constitutional lawyer. He understood the rules of evidence and the burden of proof. Across from him sat Tom Emerson, the committee's chief counsel, a former assistant U.S. attorney who had spent 20 years putting corrupt officials in prison. We are ready, Emerson said quietly. Everything is documented, every claim is sourced, and every piece of evidence would hold up in federal courts. Johnson ran his hand over the binders. There were 4 of them, color-coded. red for financial evidence, blue for communications intercepts, green for voting records, and yellow for witness statements. "Walk me through the sequencing one more time," Johnson said, "as I want to make sure the trap is unavoidable." Emerson pulled out a timeline. Phase 1 is the money. We establish the pattern and show that her campaigns received over $1 million from sources with direct ties to the Somali government. We trace the shell companies and the pass-through entities to show it was not just donations, but laundering. Phase 2 is the communications. We introduce the FISA warrants. We have 43 calls intercepted by the NSA between her and Somali officials. We do not use the classified ones, obviously, but we use the declassified intercepts, where she is coordinating on legislation, and we play the audio. Phase 3 is the votes. We overlay the money with the voting record. We show the 23 times she voted against U.S. interests and how every single vote came within 2 weeks of a payment or a call. We establish the quid pro quo. Phase 4 is the witnesses. Emerson tapped the yellow binder. This is the kill shot. We have 3 Somali American constituents who are registered Democrats and people who voted for her. They are willing to testify under oath that she told them privately that her loyalty is to Somalia first. One of them recorded the conversation. Johnson looked up sharply. "The recording is clean and admissible," Emerson confirmed. "Minnesota is a one-party consent state, so the constituent recorded her own conversation legally. And it is devastating. You hear her voice saying that you will always be Somali in your heart, because that is where your loyalty should be." Johnson nodded slowly. "And then," Emerson said, "we ask the question. We ask her simply where her loyalty lies. If she answers America, she contradicts the tapes and the witnesses, and she perjures herself. If she answers Somalia, she admits to citizenship fraud and treason. If she refuses to answer," Johnson finished. "That is the headline." He closed the briefing book feeling a heavy responsibility. He was not just trying to win a news cycle, he was about to dismantle a colleague. "Tone is everything," Johnson said, standing up. "I am not attacking her personally. I am not questioning her faith. And I am not questioning her background. I am presenting evidence of specific actions that violate federal law." "Clinical," Emerson agreed. "Professional and prosecutorial." "Let the facts speak," Johnson said. At 9:30 in the morning, Ilhan Omar walked out of her office. She was flanked by the squad, including AOC Rashida and Ayanna Pressley. They walked in a phalanx with cameras flashing, projecting solidarity and strength. Omar stopped at a microphone bank in the hallway. "This hearing is a disgrace," she declared to the press, her voice ringing out. "It is a desperate attempt to silence a voice of dissent, but I will not be silenced, nor intimidated." She looked strong and defiant. Mike Johnson entered the hearing room through a side door alone. He carried only his black binder. He did not stop for the cameras, nor give a quote. He sat down at the head of the table and checked his watch. At exactly 10 o'clock, he banged the gavel. "The House Committee on Ethics will come to order," Johnson said, his voice calm. "We are here today to investigate potential violations of the Foreign Agents Registration Act and related federal laws by Representative Ilhan Omar." Omar sat across from him, smirking slightly. She thought she was ready for a fight, but she did not know she was already in checkmate. Speaker Mike Johnson tapped the gavel against the wooden block, a singular sharp sound that cut through the murmurs in the hearing room. "Congresswoman Omar," Johnson said, his voice devoid of theatricality, "you have been subpoenaed to testify before this committee. You have the right to counsel, which I see you have exercised. You have the right to refuse to answer questions, though the committee may draw appropriate inferences from such refusal." He paused, looking over his reading glasses. "Do you understand these rights?" Omar nodded, her chin held high. "I do. Would you like to make an opening statement?" She stood up immediately. This was the moment she had prepared for, and this was the clip Marcus Osman had written for her. She smoothed her blazer and looked directly into the bank of television cameras, ignoring the Republican members of the committee entirely. "Yes, Mr. Speaker, thank you. I want to start by saying this hearing is a disgrace," Omar began, her voice projecting clearly to the back of the room. "It is political persecution disguised as oversight. I am being targeted because I am a black Muslim woman who speaks truth to power, because I criticize U.S. foreign policy, because I stand with refugees and immigrants, and because I dare to ask why we spend billions on weapons instead of healthcare and education." She was hitting her stride now, the fear she had felt earlier masked by the adrenaline of performance. "I came to this country as a refugee fleeing war," she continued, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. "I lived in a camp. I came to America with nothing. I learned English. I became a citizen. I worked hard. I served my community, and I was elected to Congress to represent my constituents. Everything I have done," she declared, gesturing broadly, "has been in service of my constituents, helping Somali Americans navigate immigration issues, advocating for policies that help refugees, and speaking out against U.S. interventions that destabilize other countries. That is not being a foreign agent. That is being a representative." In the gallery, her supporters strategically placed by her team began to applaud. It started as a smattering and grew to a roar. Johnson let it go on for exactly 4 seconds. Then he banged the gavel. "Order," he said. He did not shout, "We will have order, or I will clear the gallery." The room quieted. Omar stood for a moment longer, soaking in the energy before sitting down. She looked confident and felt she had won the opening round, framing the narrative as them versus us, the bully versus the refugee. Johnson waited for the silence to return. "Thank you for that statement, Congresswoman," he said politely. "Now let's look at the evidence." With those 6 words, the narrative Ilhan Omar had built began to disintegrate. Johnson pulled out the first set of documents from his red binder. He signaled to the aides who distributed copies to the committee members and slid a thick packet across the table to Omar's lawyer. "Let's start with campaign finance," Johnson said. "Congresswoman, your campaigns and affiliated PACs have raised approximately $8.7 million since you first ran for Congress in 2018. Does that sound accurate?" Omar glanced at Brennan, who nodded slightly. "I do not have exact numbers in front of me, but that is approximately correct." "Of that sum," Johnson said, "approximately $1.3 million came from sources with direct ties to the Somali government or Somali government-controlled entities." He looked up. "Were you aware of that?" Omar's lawyer started to speak, but Omar cut him off. "All of my campaign contributions were properly vetted and disclosed according to FEC regulations. We have strict compliance." "That was not my question," Johnson interrupted gently. "Were you aware that significant portions of your funding came from Somali government-linked sources? Yes or no?" A pause ensued. Omar shifted in her seat. "I received donations from many sources, including Somali American community organizations." "Let me be specific," Johnson said. He picked up a remote and clicked a button. A large screen behind him lit up, displaying a document with highlighted figures. "The Somali American Leadership Council," Johnson read, "donated $380,000 to your campaigns across 3 election cycles. That is the single largest organizational donor to your campaigns. That is a legitimate American organization, Omar shot back. It is incorporated in America. Yes, Johnson agreed, but let's talk about where its money comes from. The screen changed to a flowchart tracing lines of money across the globe. The Somali American Leadership Council receives 87% of its funding from the Somali Commercial Bank, Johnson explained, using a laser pointer to trace the line. The bank is headquartered in Mogadishu, and its chairman is Abdi Hassan Mahdi. Johnson continued, noting that he happens to be the brother of Somalia's finance minister. The bank is effectively controlled by individuals closely tied to the Somali government. He let that sink in. So when the Somali American Leadership Council donates to your campaign, Johnson said, where is that money really coming from? Omar's lawyer leaned forward, speaking into the mic. Mr. Speaker, the organization is a registered 501c4 in the United States, and my client followed all FEC disclosure requirements. Did she disclose that the organization was funded by a Somali government-controlled bank? Johnson asked. Did she disclose the foreign source of the funds? Silence followed. Johnson pulled out another document. Let me show you something else. This is from the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. They track money laundering. They flagged the Somali American Leadership Council 2 years ago, Johnson revealed, because of unusual money flows from Somalia, specifically large wire transfers from Mogadishu timed to coincide exactly with U.S. election cycles. He showed the timeline on the screen. June 2020 saw $150,000 wired from Mogadishu to the council, and 2 weeks later, $75,000 was donated to your campaign. October 2022 saw $100,000 from Mogadishu, and 3 weeks later, $100,000 went to your campaign. The pattern repeats, Johnson said, through 2022 and through 2024. He looked at Omar. This is not a grassroots American organization supporting your campaign, Congresswoman. This is foreign money being laundered through a U.S. entity to fund your political career. That is illegal. Omar tried to respond, her voice rising. I had no knowledge of the internal funding sources of that organization, and I cannot vet every donor's bank records. You met with Abdi Hassan Mahdi 6 times, Johnson countered, holding up a photo of the two of them shaking hands. He hosted a fundraiser for you in Minneapolis. Witnesses heard him introduce you as our voice in Congress and the representative for all Somali people here and in the homeland. You are telling me, Johnson asked skeptically, that you did not know he was connected to the Somali government. There was no good answer. If she said yes, she admitted to the crime. If she said no, she looked incompetent or deceitful. Let's move on, Johnson said, closing the folder. The council is just the beginning. The Horn of Africa Development Association donated $220,000, also funded by Somali sources. The Mogadishu Business Alliance donated $140,000. All told, Johnson summarized, we have traced $1.3 million in campaign donations to foreign sources. That is 15% of everything you have ever raised, Johnson said. And you expect us to believe you had no idea? The air in the room had shifted. The witch hunt narrative was struggling to survive against the weight of bank records and wire transfers. But Johnson was not done with the money. He opened a new section of the red binder. Let's talk about your husband, Johnson said. Ahmed Hersey runs a company called Sahan Services Group. Omar's face tightened visibly, as this was hitting close to home. According to your financial disclosures, Johnson read, that company has received $280,000 in consulting fees from various Somali businesses over the past 4 years. Johnson looked up. What services does his company provide? Omar stiffened. My husband's business is separate from my congressional work, as he is a private citizen. He works from your house, Johnson noted. You file joint tax returns, so his income is your income. So I will ask again, what did his company do to earn $280,000 from businesses in Somalia? Omar's lawyer whispered to her again. She shook her head slightly, her lips pressed into a thin line. Johnson did not wait. Let me tell you what our investigators found, he said. Sahan Services Group has no website. Johnson listed that there was no LinkedIn profile, no other clients identifiable besides these Somali businesses, and no employees other than her husband. The consulting is undefined, Johnson said, with no work product, no deliverables, and no contracts specifying services. He clicked the remote, and a new graphic appeared on the screen. But what we do have, Johnson said, is a pattern. The screen showed a timeline divided into two columns. The left column showed payments to Sahan Services Group, and the right column showed Ilhan Omar's votes on Somalia-related bills. Every payment to his company, Johnson said slowly, came within 2 weeks of you voting on Somalia-related legislation. Every single payment. He walked the committee through the chart. A payment on March 15, 2022, for $35,000 was followed by a vote on March 28, 2022, where you voted against sanctions on Somali officials. A payment on June 3, 2022, for $40,000 was followed by a vote on June 14, 2022, where you voted against placing conditions on U.S. aid to Somalia. A payment on September 10, 2023, for $25,000 was followed by a vote on September 22, 2023, where you voted against a resolution condemning human rights abuses in Mogadishu. Johnson turned back to Omar. 8 payments, he said, and 8 votes with perfect timing. This is not consulting income, Congresswoman, Johnson said, his voice hardening. These are payments for your votes. This is corruption. The room erupted. Gasps echoed from the press gallery, and someone shouted about bribery. Johnson banged the gavel hard. We will have order. Omar stood up, her hands trembling with rage. This is outrageous speculation based on coincidence. You are attacking my family because you cannot attack my record. Sit down, Congresswoman, Johnson ordered. 8 times is not a coincidence, Johnson said, his voice rising over the commotion. That is a pattern. That is evidence. And that is a quid pro quo so clear that any federal prosecutor would take it to a jury in a heartbeat. He stared at her until she slowly lowered herself back into the chair. She looked trapped. The defiance was gone, replaced by the cornered look of someone who realizes the walls are closing in. Johnson closed the red binder and moved it to the side of the table. Then he reached for the blue binder. We have talked about the money, Johnson said, his voice returning to that terrifyingly calm, clinical tone. Now, let's talk about the coordination and your communications with Somali government officials. How many times, Johnson asked, opening the blue folder, would you estimate you have spoken with members of Somalia's government since taking office in 2019? Omar looked wary. I do not keep account, but as part of my work helping constituents with immigration and consular issues, I speak to many. The FBI has a count, Johnson interrupted. He looked at the page. You have had documented contact with Somali government officials 127 times in the past 4 years, Johnson said. Phone calls, in-person meetings, and encrypted messages. 127 times, Johnson repeated. That is more contact than most State Department officials working on Somalia policy have with that government. He paused. Now, most of those communications are probably routine, Johnson allowed, such as helping a constituent with a visa issue or following up on a passport problem. That is normal congressional work. But 43 of those communications were different. He pulled out a transcript marked Top Secret No Foreign, with the classification lines redacted. 43 times, Johnson said, you discussed U.S. policy towards Somalia, pending congressional votes, information from classified briefings, and strategic matters. And Johnson added, looking straight at her, we have the transcripts. The room was still reeling from the audio recording of Ilhan Omar sharing classified information with a foreign ambassador when Mike Johnson signaled the bailiff. We have heard the documents, Johnson said, his voice cutting through the tension. We have seen the bank records, and we have heard the intercepts. But now I want to hear from the people. He looked toward the side door. I call Amina Hassan to the witness table. The door opened, and a woman in her early 40s entered. She wore a simple gray hijab and a modest dress. She clutched a handbag tightly with both hands, her knuckles pale. She did not look like a political operative, but rather like a neighbor or a mom. She took her seat at the witness table a few feet away from where Omar sat. Omar stared at her, eyes narrowed, trying to place the face. Ms. Hassan, Johnson said gently, thank you for being here. I know this is difficult, so please, for the record, tell the committee about yourself. Amina leaned into the microphone, her voice quiet and accented but clear. My name is Amina Hassan. I am a U.S. citizen. I came to America from Somalia in 1996 as a refugee when I was 16 years old. I have lived in Minneapolis ever since. I work as a pediatric nurse at Hennepin County Medical Center. I am married and I have 3 children who were all born in America. And you live in Congresswoman Omar's district? Johnson asked. Yes, the 5th district. Did you vote for her? Yes, Amina said, looking down at her hands. In 2018 and in 2020. I was very proud when she was elected. She was like us, a refugee who made it. I thought she would represent our community. I thought she would show America that Somalis love this country. Johnson nodded. What changed your mind, Miss Hassan? Amina took a deep breath. She glanced at Omar, then quickly looked away. In 2022, Amina said, there was a town hall meeting in the Cedar Riverside neighborhood. I attended because I wanted to ask about programs to help refugees integrate, such as English classes, civics classes, and job training. What happened? I asked my question. Amina said, I said that many refugees want to integrate fully to become American in their hearts, but need support. And she got angry. Amina's voice grew stronger. She told the room that we shouldn't have to assimilate. She said that assimilation is a form of colonization. She said we should keep our Somali identity first. Did you speak to her afterwards? Yes, Amina said. I approached her privately. I told her that I didn't come to America to stay Somali. I came to become American. I told her I love this country for saving my life. And what did she say? Amina paused. She looked at the Congresswoman. She looked at me like I was a traitor. Amina whispered. She leaned in close. She said, you can be American on paper, Amina, but you will always be Somali in your heart, because that is where your loyalty must be, to our people and to the homeland. The room was silent. Did anyone else hear this conversation? Johnson asked. My husband was with me, and he heard it. And what did you think when she said that? Amina wiped a tear from her cheek. I thought she didn't understand what it means to take the oath. I thought she was dangerous. Johnson leaned forward. Ms. Hassan, do you have any documentation of this conversation? Yes, Amina said. She reached into her handbag and pulled out her smartphone. After that conversation, I became suspicious. I was worried she was misleading our community. So the next time I saw her at a fundraising dinner a few months later, I turned on my voice memo app and recorded our conversation. That recording is illegal, Omar's lawyer shouted, jumping up. Minnesota requires two-party consent. Minnesota is a one-party consent state, Johnson interrupted calmly. Ms. Hassan was a party to the conversation, so the recording is legal and admissible. He nodded to the tech booth. Please play the file labeled Hassan Exhibit A. The audio crackled over the speakers. The background noise of clinking silverware and murmuring voices faded as Ilhan Omar's voice cut through, unmistakable and sharp. You have to understand, Amina. We are Somali first. That doesn't change just because we have American passports. Our loyalty, our identity, and our purpose are all tied to Somalia. America is just where we live now. It is a place to work. But Somalia is who we are. The recording ended. The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences. It wasn't shocked. It was finalized. The out-of-context defense was dead. The constituent service defense was dead. Johnson looked at the witness. Ms. Hassan, he asked, based on your interactions with her, do you believe Representative Omar's first loyalty is to the United States or to Somalia? Amina didn't hesitate. To Somalia, she said without question. Johnson dismissed the witness. Two more Somali-American witnesses followed. A business owner who was told he wasn't Somali enough because he flew an American flag at his shop, and a student who was scolded for wanting to join the U.S. military. The pattern was absolute. Johnson turned back to Omar. She was no longer looking at the cameras. She was staring at the table, her hands clenched in her lap. The defense of Islamophobia does not work here, Congresswoman, Johnson said quietly. These are your constituents, your neighbors, and people who share your faith and your background. And they are telling us under oath that you demanded they be loyal to a foreign nation. Mike Johnson closed the yellow binder. He stacked it neatly on top of the others. The red binder for money, the blue binder for calls, the green binder for votes, and now the witnesses. He folded his hands and looked at Ilhan Omar. Congresswoman, he said, let's talk about your citizenship. Omar's head snapped up. This was the nuclear option. You became a naturalized U.S. citizen in 2000, Johnson recounted. Do you remember the ceremony? Of course, she said, her voice raspy. Do you remember the oath you took? I took the standard oath. Let me read it to you, Johnson said, just to make sure we all understand exactly what you swore before God and the federal government. He picked up a piece of parchment paper. He read slowly, enunciating every syllable. I hereby declare on oath that I absolutely and entirely renounce and abjure all allegiance and fidelity to any foreign prince, potentate, state, or sovereignty of whom or which I have heretofore been a subject or citizen. He looked up. Absolutely and entirely renounce, Johnson repeated. You swore to give up all allegiance to Somalia. Did you mean that? Of course I meant it, she snapped. Then why? Johnson asked, pointing to the blue binder. Did you tell the Somali foreign minister that your first loyalty is to Somalia? Why? He pointed to the witness table. Did you tell Amina Hassan that Somalia is who we are? Why? He pointed to the screen. Did you vote for Somalia's interests over America's interests 23 times in a row? Those statements are the exact opposite of the oath you took, Johnson said. He looked back at the parchment. The oath continues stating, I will support and defend the Constitution and laws of the United States of America against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same. True faith and allegiance, Johnson said. You shared classified U.S. military intelligence with a foreign government, Johnson reminded her. You warned them about our drone operations and told them to prepare. That is not true faith and allegiance, Johnson said. That is betrayal. He read the final line of the oath stating, I take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion. Johnson leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried to every corner of the room. Without any mental reservation. Did you take that oath freely, Congresswoman, or did you have a mental reservation? Did you think to yourself that you would say these words to get the passport, but you didn't really mean them? Omar's lawyer objected, shouting something about speculation, but Johnson bulldozed right over him. Because based on the evidence we have seen today, Johnson said, based on the money, the phone calls, the coordination, the votes, and your own voice on tape, it appears you never actually renounced your allegiance to Somalia. You took the oath, you got the citizenship, you ran for Congress, and you have been serving the Somali government the entire time. That is citizenship fraud, Congresswoman, Johnson declared. That is grounds for revoking your citizenship. That is grounds for denaturalization. That is grounds for deportation. And he added, it is grounds for removing you from the House of Representatives. Omar looked terrified for the first time. She wasn't thinking about her next tweet. She was thinking about prison. She was thinking about losing her country. Johnson picked up a final sheet of paper. Based on the findings of this committee, he announced formally, we are making the following immediate referrals. First, to the Department of Justice for prosecution under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, campaign finance laws, and the Espionage Act regarding the mishandling of classified information. Second, to the Office of the Director of National Intelligence for the immediate and permanent revocation of your security clearance. Third, to U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services to open an investigation into potential fraud in your naturalization application. Fourth, to the House of Representatives for a vote on expulsion under Article 1, Section 5 of the Constitution. Each referral hit like a hammer blow. Representative Omar, Johnson said, looking her in the eye, you are hereby suspended from all committee assignments pending the outcome of these investigations. Your security clearance is revoked effective immediately. You are prohibited from entering the skiff, and this committee recommends that the full House vote on your expulsion within 30 days. Omar found her voice. It was thin, shaking, and barely audible. You can't do this. I just did, Johnson said. He closed the binder. The sound echoed in the silent room. And now, Johnson said, we return to where we started, the simple question. You have sat here for 7 hours, Johnson said. You have seen the money, you have heard the tapes, and you have heard the witnesses. So I will ask you one last time. If the United States and Somalia went to war hypothetically, which side would you want to win? The room held its breath. It wasn't a trick anymore. It was the final test. Omar looked at the camera, she looked at Johnson, and she looked at her lawyer. She opened her mouth and closed it. She couldn't say America because the evidence proved it was a lie. She couldn't say Somalia because it was a confession of treason. So she sat in silence, and in that silence, Ilhan Omar's career ended. The witness refuses to answer, Johnson noted for the record. This hearing is adjourned. He banged the gavel as he walked out, leaving her sitting alone at the table. The cameras kept rolling. They captured a woman who had come to America with nothing, achieved everything, and thrown it all away because she couldn't decide which country was home. The bang of the gavel signaled the end of the hearing. But for Ilhan Omar, it signaled the end of everything she had built. Speaker Mike Johnson didn't linger. He didn't do a victory lap. He simply gathered his binders, the red, the blue, the green, and the yellow, and walked out the side door with his staff. He looked like a lawyer leaving a courthouse after a successful closing argument, grim, professional, and entirely finished with the defendant. Omar remained seated at the witness table for a long moment. She didn't move, because she couldn't. The physical weight of the last 7 hours seemed to pin her to the chair. Her lawyer, David Brennan, was already packing up his briefcase, his movements jerky and agitated. He wasn't whispering anymore. He was avoiding eye contact. He knew a losing cause when he saw one, and he was already calculating how to distance his firm from the coming radioactive fallout. In the gallery, the supporters who had cheered so loudly at the beginning were now quiet. They had come expecting a protest, but they had witnessed an autopsy. They had heard the recordings and seen the bank transfers. It is hard to chant slogans when you have just heard your hero tell a foreign official that America is just a workspace. Omar finally stood up, her legs feeling heavy. She looked toward the press gallery, usually her sanctuary, expecting the friendly faces of reporters who would help her spin this. Instead, she saw heads down typing furiously, or worse, she saw eyes looking at her with a new, cold appraisal. They weren't looking at a celebrity anymore. They were looking at a suspect. She tried to walk out with dignity, straightening her blazer and lifting her chin. She moved toward the door, flanked by her staff. But as she entered the hallway, the wall of sound hit her. It wasn't the usual chaotic shouting of questions. It was a specific, repetitive demand. "Congresswoman, will you resign? Did you take money from the Somali government? Why couldn't you say you wanted America to win? Are you a foreign agent?" She pushed through the mob, ignoring them, her eyes fixed on the elevator doors. But she couldn't outrun the digital age. By the time she reached her office, the destruction was already viral. The clip of her silence, that excruciating 60-second freeze when asked if she wanted America to win a war, had been viewed 10 million times in 20 minutes. It was playing on every screen in the Capitol, on phones in the subway, and in living rooms in Minneapolis. But the silence was just the headline. The details were the story. The audio recording of her saying "America is just where I work" was looping on cable news. It didn't matter what network you turned on, her voice was there betraying her oath in high definition. CNN legal experts say the FARA evidence against Omar is overwhelming. MSNBC reported Democrats struggled to defend Omar amid espionage allegations. Fox News ran the banner "Traitor" in the House. The political isolation happened at the speed of light. Usually, when a member of the squad came under fire, the defense was immediate and coordinated. Tweets would fly, and statements would be issued condemning racist attacks. The progressive machine would spin into gear. Tonight, the machine was broken. Representative Rashida Tlaib was asked for a comment by a reporter in the hallway. She didn't stop. "I haven't seen the evidence," she muttered, hurrying into an elevator. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, usually the first to the keyboard, had been silent on Twitter for 4 hours. The Democratic leadership didn't just step back. They vanished. Hakeem Jeffries issued a statement at 6 in the evening. It was 2 sentences long, and it was a death sentence for her career. "The allegations presented today are grave and implicate national security. We support a full and immediate investigation by the Department of Justice." Translation: You are gone. Back in her office, Omar sat in the dark. The phone was ringing not with donors, but with angry constituents. Her staff was crying in the outer office, some shredding papers, though it was too late for that. She looked at the framed photo on her desk. a picture of her swearing-in ceremony, her hand on the Koran and her smile bright. She remembered feeling like she had conquered the world that day. Now she realized she had never really understood the victory. She thought she had won a platform and a megaphone. She didn't realize she had entered a contract, and today the breach of that contract had been laid bare for the world to see. The end didn't drag on for months. Mike Johnson had designed the hearing not just to expose, but to terminate. The evidence was too absolute for delay. 3 weeks later, the House of Representatives convened for a vote that had happened only 5 times in American history. House Resolution 902 was a resolution to expel Representative Ilhan Omar from the House of Representatives. The mood on the floor was somber. There was no shouting, and there were no protest signs. The sheer volume of evidence, including the FISA tapes, the bank records, and the witness testimony, had sucked the oxygen out of any partisan defense. Even the most progressive members of the House couldn't defend the indefensible. They couldn't go back to their districts and explain why they voted to keep a member who admitted on tape that her loyalty belonged to a foreign nation. When the clerk called the roll, the ayes didn't just come from the Republican side of the aisle. A moderate Democrat from Virginia said aye. A vulnerable Democrat from Pennsylvania said aye. A senior Democrat from New York said aye. The final tally flashed on the board: 307 to 118. 62 Democrats joined all Republicans. It was a landslide and a repudiation. Ilhan Omar stood in the well of the House for the last time. She tried to give a defiant speech, shouting about how history would vindicate her, but nobody was listening. The chamber was already emptying. The sergeant-at-arms waited respectfully but firmly at the edge of the floor to collect her member pin. She was stripped of her title, she was stripped of her office, and she was stripped of her power. But the expulsion was just the beginning of her nightmare. 2 days later, the Department of Justice unsealed a federal indictment: United States of America versus Ilhan Omar. Counts 1 through 3 were for violation of the Foreign Agents Registration Act. Counts 4 through 5 were for campaign finance fraud. Count 6 was for mishandling of classified information. Count 7 was for wire fraud. The indictment laid out the timeline Mike Johnson had presented, but with even more detail. It listed the specific dates of the wire transfers. It listed the specific classified documents she had verbally summarized to foreign officials. It was a roadmap to prison. Simultaneously, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services formally opened a denaturalization proceeding. The notice was delivered to her home. It stated that because she had taken the oath of citizenship with a mental reservation, proven by her own statements regarding her loyalty, her citizenship had been obtained by fraud. She was facing the loss of her freedom and the loss of her country. Back in Minneapolis, the 5th District was reeling, but not in the way Omar had predicted. There were no riots and there was no uprising. Instead, there was a quiet, determined reclamation. The 3 witnesses who had testified, including Amina Hassan, formed a new organization called Somali Americans for American Values. They held a press conference in the Cedar Riverside neighborhood, standing in front of a massive American flag. "We did not come here to be a colony of Mogadishu," Amina Hassan told the crowd, her voice amplified by a loudspeaker. "We came here to be free. Ilhan Omar told us we had to choose between our heritage and our home. She was wrong. We choose America," Amina said. "We choose the Constitution, and we choose the country that saved us." The applause was thunderous. It was the sound of a community shaking off the shackles of a leader who had used them as political props. 6 months later, Ilhan Omar sat in a small apartment in D.C. awaiting trial. Her passport had been surrendered. Her ankle monitor blinked green in the dim light. She watched the news on a muted TV. A special election was being held for her vacant seat. The leading candidate was a Somali-American woman, a former Marine veteran who ran on a platform of patriotism and service. Omar turned off the TV. She sat in the silence thinking about the question Mike Johnson had asked her. If the United States and Somalia went to war, which side would you want to win? She realized now that she had been fighting a war inside herself for 20 years. She had wanted the benefits of America, the power, the money, and the platform. But she had refused to give it her heart. She had tried to serve two masters, and in the end, she was left with neither. The lesson was brutal and permanent. You can be a critic of America, you can be a reformer, and you can be a dissenter, but you cannot be a traitor to the oath. When you raise your right hand and swear allegiance, it isn't a performance and it isn't a formality. It is a blood pact with the Constitution. Ilhan Omar broke that pact, and the Constitution broke her back. The narrator's voice returns to say this story is a warning to anyone who thinks the oath of office is just words on a page. Mike Johnson didn't destroy Ilhan Omar with insults. He destroyed her with the truth she tried to hide. Loyalty isn't divisible. You cannot be 50% American when the stakes are life and death. You have to choose. If this story reminded you why the oath matters, hit that like button. If you believe that our representatives must put America first, share this video. And if you want to see more deep dives into the evidence they do not want you to see, subscribe, because the truth is coming and no one is above it. In Minneapolis, the Cedar Riverside neighborhood, often affectionately called Little Mogadishu, felt different that evening. There were no riots and no burning tires in the streets. There was no angry mob marching on the federal building to demand the release of their representative. Instead, there was a quiet, suffocating sense of betrayal. Amina Hassan sat in her living room while her 3 children did homework at the kitchen table. The television was on, tuned to the local news. The volume was low, but the words were inescapable. They were playing the clip that was circulating around the globe, the 60 seconds of silence where Ilhan Omar couldn't say she wanted America to win. Then they played the audio recording where she said, "America is just where we live now. It is a place to work. But Somalia is who we are." Amina watched the screen, her tea growing cold in her hands. She remembered the hope she had felt in 2018. She remembered the pride of seeing a Somali woman in a hijab standing in the U.S. Capitol. She remembered telling her daughters to see that, in America, anything is possible. Now she realized that the woman on the screen hadn't been fighting for them. She had been using them. "She made us look like enemies," Amina whispered to her husband, who sat silently beside her. "She made us look like we don't belong here. She told the world that we are lying when we say we love this country." That was the true damage of Ilhan Omar's legacy. It wasn't just the money or the classified leaks. It was the shadow she had casted over an entire community of refugees who simply wanted to be Americans. By refusing to renounce her foreign allegiance, she had validated every suspicion, every slur, and every doubt ever cast upon them. Across the neighborhood in the halal markets and the community centers, the mood was the same. Men who had driven taxis for 20 years to put their kids through college shook their heads in disgust. Women who had started small businesses stared at the floor. They had escaped warlords, and they had escaped corruption. They had come to Minnesota for the rule of law, and now their representative was facing federal indictment for bringing the corruption of the old country into the halls of the new one. 300 miles away, Speaker Mike Johnson sat in his office in the Capitol. The hearing room was empty, the cameras were gone, and the halls were quiet. His communications director walked in looking energized. "Mr. Speaker." "The numbers are incredible," the aide said, holding up a tablet. "The clip has 50 million views. Donations to the NRCC are up 200% in 4 hours. Every cable network wants you for the morning shows. You destroyed her." Johnson didn't smile. He didn't look up from his desk where he was methodically organizing the binders, red, blue, green, and yellow, into a storage box. "We didn't destroy her," Johnson said quietly. "She destroyed herself. All we did was turn on the lights." "But, sir," the aide pressed, "this is a massive political win. We need to capitalize. We should do a press conference on the steps tomorrow to spike the football." Johnson stopped. He looked at the aide with a stern, teacher-like expression. "No," Johnson said. "There will be no spiking of the football. This isn't a game. A member of the United States Congress was just exposed as a foreign agent. That is a tragedy for the country. It means our vetting failed. It means our security clearance process failed. It means a district in Minnesota was lied to for 6 years." He closed the box and taped it shut. "We did our duty," Johnson said. "We upheld the Constitution. That is enough. Go home." "Go." The aide nodded, chastened, and left the room. Johnson sat alone for a moment. He thought about the oath. "I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic." He had said those words. Ilhan Omar had said those words. The difference was he feared the consequences of breaking them, while she evidently did not. His phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text message from the chairman of the House Oversight Committee. "The referral is ready for the next one, with a different name but the same pattern, and the evidence looks solid." Johnson stared at the phone. There was no joy in it, just the heavy realization that the rot went deeper than one person. The filing cabinet of corruption was deep, and they were only on the first drawer. He sighed, picked up his pen, and texted back to bring the binders to his office at 8 o'clock. He turned off the lamp, knowing the work would continue tomorrow. 3 weeks later, the House of Representatives convened for the final act. The resolution to expel Representative Ilhan Omar was brought to the floor. The debate was surprisingly short. The usual defenders of the squad were absent or muted. It is hard to defend a colleague who is facing a federal indictment for espionage and foreign agent registration violations. When the roll was called, the result was a landslide, 307 to 118. 62 Democrats crossed the aisle to vote for expulsion. They did it to save their own careers, certainly, but some did it because they had heard the tapes. They had heard the contempt in her voice for the country they served. Ilhan Omar stood in the well of the House, stripped of her committees, stripped of her security clearance, and now stripped of her seat. She tried to look defiant, but she looked diminished. The sergeant-at-arms approached her. "Madam," he said respectfully but firmly, "I must ask for your pin." Slowly, with shaking hands, she unfastened the Member of Congress pin from her lapel, the pin that gave her access to the floor, to the cloakroom, and to power. She placed it in his hand. She walked out of the chamber a private citizen, but the American justice system was just getting started. 2 days later, the Department of Justice unsealed the indictment, United States versus Ilhan Omar. It contained 7 counts including violations of FARA, wire fraud, and mishandling national defense information. Simultaneously, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services formally initiated denaturalization proceedings. The logic was legally airtight. Because she had sworn an oath of allegiance to the U.S. while secretly maintaining allegiance to Somalia, as proven by her own statements, her citizenship had been obtained through fraud. She was facing prison, followed by deportation. Back in Minneapolis, the special election to replace her was held 3 months later. The winner wasn't a hand-picked successor from Omar's political machine. It was Amina Hassan, the nurse who had testified against her. Amina hadn't wanted to run, but the community had drafted her. They wanted someone who represented the true immigrant story, the story of gratitude, integration, and patriotism. In her victory speech, Amina stood in front of an American flag. "We are not here to change America," Amina told the cheering crowd. "We are here because America changed us. We are here to serve the country that saved our lives. Never again will we let someone use our identity to divide us from our neighbors." The district healed, the rhetoric cooled, and the reputation of the Somali-American community, tarnished by Omar's dual loyalty, began to be restored by a new generation of leaders who understood what the oath meant. 6 months later, Ilhan Omar sat in a federal holding facility in Virginia, awaiting the start of her trial. Her passport was gone, her Twitter account was silent, and the cameras had moved on to the next scandal. She had time to think now. She thought about the interview Mike Johnson had referenced. She thought about the moment of silence. If the United States and Somalia went to war, which side would you want to win? She realized too late that she had tried to be a citizen of the world, and in doing so had become a citizen of nowhere. She had tried to leverage the power of the United States to serve the interests of Somalia, and the Constitution had crushed her for it. The lesson was brutal, permanent, and etched into the history books. You can be a critic, you can be a reformer, and you can be a radical. But you cannot be a traitor to the oath. When you raise your right hand and swear allegiance, it is a blood pact. It demands your soul and it demands your total loyalty. Ilhan Omar held something back. She kept a piece of her loyalty for herself, for her ego, and for a foreign power. And in the end, it cost her everything. The narrator's voice returns to say this story is a warning to every elected official who forgets who they work for. Mike Johnson didn't destroy Ilhan Omar with insults or political ads. He destroyed her with the truth she spoke when she thought no one was listening. Loyalty isn't divisible. You cannot be 50% American when the stakes are high. You have to choose. Ilhan Omar chose Somalia, and America showed her the door. If this story reminded you why the oath of office is sacred, hit that like button. If you believe that our representatives must put America first always, share this video. And if you want to see more deep dives into the evidence they don't want you to see involving the other binders in Mike Johnson's office, subscribe because the truth is coming. The filing cabinet is full, and no one is above the oath.